Last time on Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast, we covered the first half of the first stave, Marley's Ghost, and today we will be wrapping up the rest of that stave. I will be breaking down the ghost story tropes that appear, various scenes that are often left out of adaptations, and much more. So stay tuned on this episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. A Christmas Carol Deep Dive, Marley's Ghost, Part 2. So, like last time, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle Munley's audiobook of A Christmas Carol. Again, this is from LibriVox, a site that gives free public domain recordings of public domain works. Check them out. There's a lot you can listen to on there. It's a wonderful resource. So, we will begin this episode, and I will jump in with commentary.
Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for no one lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost shone or hung about the black old gateway of the house, that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold.
The genius of the weather is simply a personification of the weather, like Mother Nature or Old Man Winter.
Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar.
The phrase, a bad lobster in a dark cellar, has stuck out to a lot of readers over the years, and plenty of people have theorized about what exactly it means. The prevailing explanation involves bioluminescence, which is the glow that crustaceans give off. Now, the Muppet version of A Christmas Carol has some fun with this, and at one point you can even spot a Muppet lobster in a cellar singing.
It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and, though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again.
As I mentioned in the very first episode, Marley on the door is one of those images from the story that has become so iconic that pretty much every film adaptation will include it. and if they don't, they're making a deliberate choice to exclude it. Now, the early TV versions often didn't have it because we didn't even see Scrooge outside his own home in a lot of those, but the cinematic versions with considerable budget always do. In live action, they will usually just project Marley's face onto the knocker, which works well enough, but animated versions tend to go all the way and actually morph the knocker into Marley's face. Some do it very well, like the Richard Williams short, which makes it eerie without being over the top, but some of them go too far.
To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, and walked across the hall, and up the stairs. Slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip.
The vision of a hearse driving up Scrooge's stairs shows us a few things. Presumably, this is Jacob Marley's hearse, so it's basically another vision of Marley. Additionally, it shows us just how expansive Scrooge's home is. A few adaptations will include a version of this scene to varying degrees of success. It can be hard to convey that someone has strange images in their head without making it look a little silly.
Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire-guard, old shoes, old fish-baskets, washing-stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door, and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing-gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel.
Gruel is similar to porridge or oatmeal, and it was thought of as a poverty food. Scrooge's charwoman, which is basically someone who cleaned his house for a few hours in the day, would have presumably left a fire for him and prepared the gruel for him. It is important to note that Scrooge did have dinner in the tavern before this, so this is not all he is eating, despite some versions leaving out that tavern scene and suggesting this is all he's having for dinner.
It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obligated to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like featherbeds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles pulling off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one.
A few things about the biblical murals here, which are usually left out of adaptations, and understandably so, because Scrooge seeing Marley here might be a little bit repetitive. My interpretation of this scene has always been that Marley on the door knocker was a surprise to Scrooge, but he is very aware of what is happening with the murals. He knows he can't shake Marley from his mind now. The fact that a Dutch merchant built the fireplace is likely a reference to Washington Irving, who wrote about Dutch settlers in New York. In the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Irving also wrote about a visit to England and the Christmas traditions he observed there. Dickens was inspired by Irving, and the two wrote letters to each other, with Dickens even visiting Irving when he came to America in 1842. The Pharaoh's daughter in question could either be the daughter of Pharaoh who found the young Moses in the rushes, or Pharaoh's daughter who married Solomon. The Queen of Sheba gets just a passing reference in the Hebrew Bible, but much has been written about her, usually also depicting her as one of Solomon's wives. I have tried to figure out what exactly apostles putting out to sea in butter boats refers to, but there doesn't appear to be a consensus. One interpretation says that the design of the mural makes the boats look like butter trays, which makes the most sense of anything I've seen. The most notable character mentioned here is Belshazzar, the Babylonian king who famously saw the writing on the wall, a fairly on the nose metaphor for what Scrooge is currently experiencing.
"Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks of the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains.
The idea of ghosts dragging chains goes back almost as far as ghost stories have been written down. The first reference we have to ghosts dragging chains comes from Pliny the Younger, who was born in ancient Rome in 60 AD. I will be reading one of the ghost stories that Pliny wrote of in his letter to Sora, and this is a translation by William Melmoth. Now, the following story, which I am going to tell you just as I heard it, is not more terrible than the former, while quite as wonderful. There was at Athens a large and roomy house, which had a bad name, so that no one could live there. In the dead of the night a noise, resembling the clashing of iron, was frequently heard, which, if you listened more attentively, sounded like the rattling of chains, distant at first, but approaching nearer by degrees. Immediately afterwards a spectre appeared in the form of an old man, of extremely emaciated and squalid appearance, with a long beard and disheveled hair, rattling the chains on his feet and hands. The distressed occupants meanwhile passed their wakeful nights under the most dreadful terrors imaginable. This, as it broke their rest, ruined their health, and brought on distempers. Their terror grew upon them, and death ensued. even in the daytime, though the spirit did not appear. Yet the impression remained so strong upon their imaginations that it still seemed before their eyes and kept them in perpetual alarm. Consequently, the house was at length deserted, as being deemed absolutely uninhabitable, so that it was now entirely abandoned to the ghost. However, in hopes that some tenant might be found who was ignorant of this very alarming circumstance, a bill was put up, giving notice that it was either to be let or sold. It happened that Athenodorus the philosopher came to Athens at this time, and, reading the bill, inquired the price. The extraordinary cheapness raised his suspicion. Nevertheless, when he heard the whole story, he was so far from being discouraged that he was more strongly inclined to hire it, and in short, actually did so. When it grew towards evening, he ordered a couch to be prepared for him in the front part of the house, and, after calling for a light, together with his pencil and tablets, directed all his people to retire. But that his mind might not, for want of employment, be open to the vain terrors of imaginary noises and spirits, he applied himself to writing with the utmost attention. The first part of the night passed in entire silence, as usual. At length a clanking of iron and rattling of chains was heard. However, he never lifted up his eyes nor laid down his pen, but, in order to keep calm and collected, tried to pass the sounds off to himself as something else. The noise increased and advanced nearer, till it seemed at the door, and at last in the chamber. He looked up, saw, and recognized the ghost exactly as it had been described to him. It stood before him, beckoning with the finger like a person who calls another. Athenodorus in reply made a sign with his hand that it should wait a little, and threw his eyes again upon his papers. The ghost then rattled its chains over the head of the philosopher, who looked up upon this, and seeing it beckoning as before, immediately arose, and, light in hand, followed it. The ghost suddenly stalked along, as if encumbered with its chains, and, turning into the area of the house, suddenly vanished. Athenodorus, being thus deserted, made a mark with some grass and leaves on the spot where the spirit left him. The next day, he gave information to the magistrates, and advised them to order that spot to be dug up. This was accordingly done, and a skeleton of a man in chains was found there. But the body, having lain a considerable time in the ground, was putrefied and mouldered away from the fetters. The bones, being collected together, were publicly buried, and thus after the ghost was appeased by the proper ceremonies, the house was haunted no more. This ghost story follows the typical convention of a person not receiving a proper burial, hence they come back as a ghost due to unfinished business. The chains in Pliny's tale are simply what the man was buried in, but they became a standard of ghost stories, and they likely were one before Pliny's tale as well. This is just the first known instance of chains in writing. However, the image of rattling chains remained tied to ghost stories, and it was a common image in the public consciousness when Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. On one hand, Dickens follows some common ghost story conventions with Marley's haunting, in addition to Marley being chained. While some adaptations might not make this clear, Marley is haunting Scrooge in the home Marley used to live in. However, unlike so many ghost stories, we learn that Marley is not trapped in his old home as he travels the world desiring to help others. This is simply the first time he has been able to manifest. Additionally, Marley is haunting Scrooge due to unfinished business, but it's not related to an improper burial. That's why Dickens goes into so much detail at the beginning of the book that Marley was undoubtedly dead and everything was handled in the proper fashion regarding his funeral. It's setting up that this is not your standard ghost or haunted house story, and we should not read it as such.
The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then coming up the stairs. Then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash-boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now.
So, this is a little play on words on Dickens' part. By saying Marley had no bowels, people were referencing bowels of compassion, a phrase used in the Christian Bible to represent a spirit of giving. Since Scrooge is now looking through Marley, he can literally see that he has no bowels. The line is actually referenced in the Frederick March version of A Christmas Carol when Scrooge says the line as a piece of dialogue.
No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say, "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel, in his heart, by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones.
Again, this is one of those moments where the narrator offers an amusing contradiction. We see Scrooge cracking jokes all throughout the story, but he's probably lying to himself at this point to calm himself down.
To sit, staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case. For though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "You see this toothpick," said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. You're not looking at it. But I see it, said the ghost, notwithstanding. Well, returned Scrooge, I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug! At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face.
I love that Scrooge keeps offering all these logical explanations to Marley, and Marley just screams so loudly that it stops them all. After this, Scrooge just believes in him and moves on with the scene.
"Mercy," he said, "dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge, "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness."
The specific religious references are there, but for the most part, Dickens' idea of an afterlife here is that there are people who helped humanity and those who did not. It doesn't matter their religion or creed. His message was that Christmas should represent that spirit of giving and helping others all year round. So Marley is doomed to walk the earth merely because he did not help others.
Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chains and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed, in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow," the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and travelling all the time." "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." "You travel fast?" said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chains so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labour by mortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." "But you are always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?"
Dickens is drawing attention to a very specific aspect of the biblical Christmas story here. Marley mentions the wise men visiting the stable up poor abode, though wise, rich, and important men are giving to the poor and needy, in this case Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. And Marley regrets that he never did this, despite having the opportunity constantly.
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost.
Just in case there were any questions up until this point about whether Marley is in purgatory or hell, the mention of penance makes it abundantly clear here that it's the former. He is working off his sins to cleanse himself for heaven.
"I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye."
So, this is a small detail that is often missed. Marley specifically arranged for the haunting to happen because he wants to help his friend avoid the same fate he has. That's what procuring references.
"You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look for me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us."
You've likely heard of the concept of the witching hour, the time of night when supernatural events allegedly occur most frequently. There are varying explanations for what time this actually is, but the most common times given are either midnight to 1 o'clock, which we get here, or 3 a.m. to 4 a.m.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever.
This is such a haunting image, and so many adaptations leave it out. Countless Marleys wandering the world, trying to do good, but not being able to anymore. The 1951 film includes the scene just as it exists in the book, including the woman and her baby. Even if the effects are a little dated, it still captures the scene wonderfully. Both versions of The Stingiest Man in Town have Marley sing about a few of the other spirits. And Scrooge 1970 has Marley and Scrooge fly through the air seeing phantoms. But in that film, we don't get any indication that they have regrets or that they long to do good now. They're just ghosts flying through the air. The 1977 BBC version also has a brief glimpse of them, again with no indication of their intention. However, as we go on through later adaptations, we will get this scene on occasion at least. What's interesting and important to note about this scene is it's right outside Scrooge's window. These phantoms can't help the woman and her baby anymore, but Scrooge can. He's turning a blind eye to all the suffering that's right outside his door.
Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window, and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. End of Stave 1.
All right, so that's where we're going to stop for this episode, because that is the end of the first stave. I wanted to separate this into 2 halves because there's just so much in each of these parts of the first stave, and Marley's Haunting really deserved its own episode. One of the most iconic images from the book, maybe the most iconic, and one of the most famous ghost hauntings just in fiction. If we think of iconic ghost stories, this might not be our first thought because it's not considered really a horror story, but absolutely a ghost story. It's right in the title. and it influenced a lot of ghost stories, and as we see here, it took influence from a lot of other ghost stories. So, yeah, I wanted to include that whole ghost story from thousands of years ago because really interesting to see where the first written record of ghosts rattling chains is. Not something Dickens made up. It was much, much older, and even though he had the most iconic version, it's continued on since as well. So next week we will continue with the Ghost of Christmas Past. The stave is called the First of the Three Spirits. Lots of Marleys, as I've talked about, tend to really overplay the scene. There's an obvious temptation to do that because he only gets one scene unless they're adding some, and you really want to make the most of it. And to get it to an extent, you want to show Scrooge scared by this, so he's prepared for the rest of the events of the night. He needs to be properly scared. But some missed that humanity in Marley too, which again, he's the one who set this whole thing in motion. He procured it. I do think some versions missed that. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that he was behind this. A lot of the Marleys we've talked about so far, up until about 1979, fall on the over the top end of the scale. But there's a few I really like so far. We talked about Basil Rathbone in the Shower of Stars version, where Frederick March plays Scrooge. Best version of Marley we've covered. Also, really like the Jack Latham character in An American Christmas Carol. Very subtle, very cold, but still believable. So, those are two of my favorites that we've talked about so far. I like Michael Hordern too in both of his versions. Others, just they're often forgettable, often way too over the top. The 1938 one, either of the ones where Basil Rathbone played Scrooge, the actors playing Marley weren't memorable. The 49 one's really over the top. It's really the most hit or miss character when it comes to portrayals outside of probably Scrooge, and it may even be more hit or miss than Scrooge. It's between those two because yeah, a lot of them just milk it for all it's worth, and it's just a bit much. But yeah, so that is this episode of Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Thank you for listening, and I'm really enjoying this series. I hope you are too. Like I said, next week we will begin Stave 2, the first of the three spirits. Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast, is written, edited, and hosted by Collin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks. The LibriVox audiobook in this episode is A Christmas Carol read by Kyle Mundley. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. All sources used in this episode can be found on the episode description on wherever you get your podcasts, or on the video details on YouTube. I'll be back next month with another episode of Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.